and welcome back to Long COVID MD. I'm your host, Dr. Zeest Khan, a physician with Long COVID, here to help you understand your body and understand your healthcare so you can move forward. Now, it goes without saying, many of us have been lonely. Even apart from long COVID, the Surgeon General has warned about a loneliness pandemic as a public health danger. One antidote to loneliness is community, but how can we build a community when we're so energy depleted? I've been curious about this topic since the congressional hearings on long COVID that were held in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. In the audience, I saw at least a dozen people in matching shirts from the group Long COVID Moonshot. They had trekked to DC from all over the country to advocate for funding, while presumably struggling with long COVID themselves. And it got me thinking, how do you organize and act effectively as a group when the bulk of your members have significant physical limitations from long COVID? I reached out to Long COVID Moonshot to learn more and met Ezra Spier, who joined me to discuss this very topic. Ezra is an Oakland, California-based patient researcher, a person with long COVID, and creator of the website Long COVID Studies. He is a member of Long COVID Moonshot and the patient-led research collaborative. Outside of long COVID advocacy, Ezra is an independent operations and technology consultant who helps organizations thrive through periods of growth. We talk about Ezra's journey with long COVID, his involvement with Long COVID Moonshot, and his approach of collaborating with compassion in order to meet the needs of his community and meet goals they've set for themselves. We also talk about his morning walks with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ed Yong and birds. Let's get started. Ezra, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love it if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about your life before long COVID and your journey with long COVID.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. So yeah, I'm Ezra and I'm 37. I live in Oakland, California. And before long COVID, I was super active. I was working as an independent technology and operations consultant, helping small businesses grow, become better places to work, become more efficient. Had a really active social life, traveled a lot, used to do heavy weightlifting workouts 3 days a week. And, you know, when the pandemic first hit, even among my friends, I was always one of the folks that was kind of most concerned about COVID. I was, when I am nervous, when I'm anxious about something, I want to learn about it. And so even well before I got sick, I was following the epidemiology. I was learning about respirators and masks and antivirals. And to me, watching doctors and researchers understand the chaos brought me a lot of confidence and clarity and helped me understand how to live my life. And I was pretty lucky in that I didn't get sick for a long time. But in September 2022, I went on a weekend trip with some friends and ended up getting COVID for the first time. And, you've heard this story before. My infection was relatively mild in its acute phase. I had about 24 hours of fever and really bad headaches, and then it kind of receded into a cold. But about a week after I first got sick, I remember waking up one day, it was a Monday, and I was like, something is different. Something has changed. And what had changed was that I just felt this intense wave of fatigue, and not tiredness, fatigue in a way I'd never really experienced before. And, I had known, because of what my friends had told me about their infections, that it might take me a few weeks to get better. But what they didn't tell me is that it would be really difficult for me to get through a work Zoom call. And, I sort of tried to rest as much as possible. I knew long COVID was a risk. I had read articles about it. I even had friends who had long COVID. That's why I had tried to be so careful to avoid it. But, I sort of said, it's relatively rare. It's not a sure thing. I just need a rest and I'll be okay. Well, about 2 months after I got sick, I sort of thought to myself, I should be fine by now. And I had a um, intense day with long walks and staying up late. And the next day I woke up in my first long COVID crash that lasted about 2 months. And it was during those
Wow.
2 months that I finally sought out medical care. Didn't get a ton of support. And at one point, one of my friends said to me, wow, I've never met anybody with long COVID before. And that was when it hit me that I had
Wow.
long COVID. And, here we are almost 2 years later. I think it's been about 20 months, and I'm still dealing with the same symptoms. The worst one for me is post exertional malaise triggered by cognitive exertion. I have POTS. I have numbness in my feet, and I'm lucky in that I consider myself kind of mild to moderate, but those symptoms have completely changed my life. I quit work. I've actually only resumed paid work about 2 weeks ago, and that was
Oh,
very much part time. And, I've really reoriented my life around how do I manage my symptoms so that I don't get worse and hopefully get better.
thank you so much for sharing that. It is, you said, a familiar story, but devastating for each person who experiences it. Unlike a lot of people, though, you undertook a project to understand some of the science that was coming out, and you run a website that helps patients and their families with long COVID understand these studies that are actively going on with long COVID. Can you tell us about your website? It's called Long COVID Studies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said earlier, when I am faced with challenge and uncertainty, I just want to learn. And when I realized that the healthcare system didn't have a good answer for me in terms of getting better, I realized, again, like another familiar story, I realized that I needed to become an expert myself. And so I really dove in. I read journal articles. I started going to medical webinars that share the latest research. I just tried to learn as much as I could about long COVID. And over the course of, the first year I was sick, I really learned a lot. I do not have a background in biomedical research. The last time I took a biology class was in high school, but I do love to learn and I'm not afraid of diving in. And it really helped me understand what was happening in my body. Ultimately, that's what it gave me. It hasn't given me treatments or solutions so much as understanding. And a big part of what I started learning about when I was doing this research was clinical trials, where researchers and doctors work together to try interventions, whether they be drugs or therapies or other things to see if they help people. And last spring, I learned about a clinical trial at Stanford University studying Paxlovid in long COVID. It's actually a trial that the results just came out a couple weeks ago, and I joined that trial as a participant. And it was pretty involved. I had 5 visits. I don't live that close to Stanford. It was I learned the hard way that I really wasn't healthy enough to drive there on my own. But what was so interesting to me was trials are not designed to provide medical care. In fact, they cannot do that. They're there to do research. But the compassion and understanding I got from the research coordinators, who mostly when you're in a trial, you don't interact with the doctors, you interact with sort of the folks running the study who are often, recently out of college, they're really excited, but they have time and they have context. And I built relationships with these folks who were involved in the medical system, and I felt so seen. I felt like I had agency, and I felt like I was taking what to me was a really difficult negative situation and doing something productive with it, both for me and for people in a similar situation as me. And that just like blew my mind. Since then, I have been so obsessed with clinical trials. And what I really wanted to do was to help other folks have that experience. So the website is called Long COVID Studies, and it was actually inspired by another advocate named Megan Stone, who sort of randomly just tweeted out, hey, wouldn't it be great if there was an easier way for people with long COVID to find clinical trials? I picture a website that takes the data from clinicaltrials.gov and puts it in a way that's easy for patients like us who are maybe overwhelmed with details just to get what they need. And when she posted that, I thought, I don't hear good ideas all that often, but this is a good idea. And I found myself just continuing to think about it. And about 6 months later, I launched basically the site that she pitched me on, pitched me and the rest of Twitter on, and Long COVID Studies was born.
How amazing. I mean, I encourage listeners to jump on your website because it is actually very easy to navigate. Um, I am familiar with the government websites that list clinical trials. I know how to, uh, search them and understand the wording. But I am realizing during my experience as a patient just how inaccessible these studies are to patients. And to me, the story that you've told is so remarkable in multiple ways. One, as a physician, it makes me sad that it is difficult to access quality, compassionate medical care that does not feel rushed. I feel grateful that there are people within the healthcare system who might be able to provide more time, because time is so healing, and we as physicians are kind of not even allowed anymore to spend time there or investigate that and really value that. So I'm glad that somebody in the healthcare space in this process and the system was able to provide that for you, that benefited you and then inspired you too, or motivated you. It's also remarkable that this website that's so helpful was a project that came out of a community. It was someone in our virtual space who shared a thought, shared an idea, and you and were able to pick that up and offer something back.
Yeah, I love that so much. I mean, I think so much of my experience as a person with long COVID has been understanding how much stronger we are together. And, as humans, we're social creatures. We're mammals. We need people. And one of the most challenging parts of my illness has been that I have really strict limits on how much time I can spend with other people because it triggers my symptoms. And, finding these ways of connecting with people that really get it, who are also struggling, has been incredibly meaningful to me. And, I don't think our medical system is really designed to provide that kind of support. I have a great mental health therapist who's been really supportive. But I have to say, despite the challenges I've had getting quality care in the healthcare system, I have so much compassion for doctors and all the other medical professionals because the system is tough for them too. And, if they had the time if they just had the time to, you know, learn about some of the more recent research findings, or if they had the resources to really spend with individual patients, it would be a totally different system. I think the other thing that's been really eye-opening to me, and part of the reason why I'm so motivated and so interested in clinical trials, is that our healthcare system really prioritizes and pays for what is called evidence-based care. What does that mean, though? And as a patient, it doesn't mean what you think it might mean. I mean, there are really specific ways that evidence gets created and adopted within the healthcare system. And for a condition like long COVID that is relatively new, I mean, it takes decades to develop the amounts of evidence that are really needed to easily give providers algorithms and care pathways and all these things that they're used to having for many of the conditions they treat. And so clinical trials and research studies are one of the most, I mean, they are the way that evidence is generated. And that's another one of my motivations and interests in this area.
Long COVID patients, similar to other patients who have fatiguing symptoms, are not as easily able to follow up and participate with clinical studies on a regular basis. There are real limitations that we have. So it seems like that's another obstacle to getting evidence based treatments out there. And yet we are each undergoing clinical studies on our own. We're trialing different medications and seeing how they work on us and seeing what side effects come up and seeing what doses are appropriate. These are all things that are measured in most clinical studies on a scale. Are accessing long COVID patients at scale requires a little bit more creativity. You mentioned crowdsourcing, essentially, to bring up different ideas and to be the basis of our community, these virtual outlets. Tell me about another organization that you're involved with, Long COVID Moonshot. I have learned about Long COVID Moonshot during the congressional hearings earlier this year that were led by Bernie Sanders discussing the needs of patients with long COVID and the need for the federal government to continue to fund research. I saw a lot of people in the audience wearing teal or turquoise colored shirts and found out that these were volunteers with an organization called Long COVID Moonshot that was advocating for more research funding. It seems to me all of these people must have been able to connect through virtual outlets and social media. It is probably an organization that is has a special type of culture because it is filled with patients with fatiguing symptoms. So, can you tell me about Long COVID Moonshot and the goals that Long COVID Moonshot has?
Yeah, absolutely. So, long COVID moonshot is pretty simply a group of patients organizing around the urgent need for long COVID research funding and other issues important to our community. Um, it sort of came together last fall around a commentary that was written in the journal Nature by Lisa McCorkle from Patient Led Research Collaborative and Michael Peluso from UCSF. The title of it is Long COVID Research Risks Losing Momentum. We Need a Moonshot. And if you haven't read that piece, I highly recommend that folks go back and read it because it's really interesting. It's from two people who have been involved with long COVID research since the beginning of 2020 and who have seen firsthand where things are going well and where things really need some extra oomph. And it's a nuanced piece, but it really catalyzed within many parts of the long COVID community this idea that, wow, we might lose momentum. I think many of us feel like we don't even have enough momentum yet. But to lose what we already have. That, I think, just raised a lot of alarm bells and warning signs for a lot of people. And so Long COVID Moonshot as an organization came up from social media, a group of folks who had gotten to know each other, folks with long COVID, folks with other chronic illnesses from before the pandemic, people with a really wide range of professional backgrounds, including former scientists, artists, web developers, creative directors, communications professionals, folks who really kind of demonstrate the fact that long COVID affects everybody, and came together and said, well, what do we do about this? What can we do as chronically ill people who have a limited amount of energy? How can we help make this happen? And the idea of a moonshot really appeals to me because it is talking about, like, the idea of the moonshot, right, is the big investment that the US government made to get astronauts to the moon. And it's a vision of the future that is about progress. It is about coming together. It is about doing hard things successfully. And so the group really catalyzed around this idea, like, what if we put our limited resources into advocating for this? And I think we really came together around the number in that editorial and the Nature piece, calling for at least $1 billion of funding for at least 10 years. And, I think we could argue about, is that the right number? Is that too small? Is that too big? Is it unrealistic? But ultimately, I think to me, it's about the sustained investment and a meaningful investment. And one of the nuances in that piece that I come back to all the time is, I didn't, like I said, I didn't know much about how research happened before I got sick. But the National Institutes of Health in the United States really funds the bulk of biomedical research in the US. It is the most important, biggest funder. Every research university gets a huge amount of its budget directly from the NIH. And one of the issues that Lisa McCorkle and Michael Palooza talk about is that if you're a grad student or a postdoc, you're deciding what you're going to spend the rest of your career studying. And you want to study something that you can get paid for. I want a job that pays me. I have no issues with that. But the funding for long COVID is not perpetual. We had this one-time infusion for Recover of $1.15 billion. And there was recently another 500 million added, but there's no guarantee of that continuing. So if I was a postdoc trying to decide what project to work on, I would want to go somewhere that is going to pay me the rest of my career. And so we're at this moment where there's a big risk of some of the best and brightest and most enthusiastic. A lot of the biggest research breakthroughs come from people earlier in their careers, where they might choose to not work on long COVID, even if they're interested in it. And that is such a huge problem. So I think all of those things together is why we're so passionate about the idea of a moonshot. And we really came together at first around an advocacy action where we asked folks to call their representatives to ask for a moonshot. And the reception was really positive. We were able to get a lot of calls made and letters written. And we really came together in January around that Bernie Sanders Senate help hearing. It was something that we learned about, kind of like everybody else, a little bit at the last minute. And the amount of energy and enthusiasm that came in, both within the group at the time and from folks completely unattached, but also aligned and motivated, was really significant. And we've been trying to kind of build off of that progress ever since.
Thank you for summarizing that. It was very remarkable for me to see a group of people who I knew were struggling and who had made a huge effort to travel and organize, show up to DC in support of additional funding for long COVID research. It is so nice to hear from you to get clarification on this issue of grants, the way research is funded, and that it has to be, if not lucrative, then financially sustainable for postgrads and people who run labs to do what they do and to pursue their interests. So it is absolutely important. There's so much to our system uh, that it is difficult to understand all of it, especially when before we fell ill, did not have much of a need to know all of the details. How then do you and maybe other people in the group share your skill sets, which are plentiful and diverse, without affecting your own health? I When I think about organizations that are mostly made up of patients with chronic illness, I think there must be a specific type of culture or the way that this group is organized to meet the needs of its members so that you don't, quite frankly, have a post exertional malaise episode recurrently and that you don't burn out. How does Long COVID Moonshot make its organization sustainable for its members? Or maybe personally, how do you make your advocacy effort sustainable for you?
That is such a good question. And in some ways, I wish I had a better answer than I do. It is really hard. You
Yeah,
know,
I bet.
anybody who has post-exertional malaise or another fatiguing symptom and needs to pace, you know how hard it is to pace. And when there are external deadlines imposed upon you, when there's not enough notice, it really comes against the kinds of self-discipline and um, kind of rules we need to set up for each of us individually and organizationally. So I think the short answer is we're still figuring it out. I
Mhm.
think one thing you might notice if you follow Long COVID Moonshot is that we have periods where we're really active and we have periods where we're really quiet. And a lot of that is because we end up having to push really hard to make things happen, and it's almost like an organizational push crash cycle. And so I like to say we have it all figured out and everything's great, but we are still figuring it out. And I think, coming at my perspective, from my perspective of someone that works with organizations and processes, the most important thing is to learn from your experiences. And it's okay to not get it right the first time, but the important thing is to learn and grow and to be really honest with yourself about what works and what not. But I want to give one example of kind of the brilliance and the challenge of working with other chronically ill people. So we have a huge mix of folks, different work backgrounds, different skill sets, and also different symptom severities. So we have people in the group who are very severe, who are not able to participate in a audio or video call ever. And so we've learned to do a lot of our work asynchronously and a lot of work by text chat. But we also have members and collaborators who really struggle with that kind of text processing. And so they really need to do video chats. And so, how do we as an organization accommodate all of those needs? Well, it takes a lot of extra work. Sometimes we have to have conversations over and over again in different contexts. We actually have some folks who participate who don't have long COVID, but who are allies, who are really, really strong allies, who sometimes can help us bridge those gaps when we need them to. And so I think, for me as someone that came to all of this from the perspective of like an organizational coach, it's been really eye-opening to see how these accommodations, we can call them accommodations, but to me that sounds almost negative. When we are compassionate and understanding of one another within an organization, you unlock so much creativity and productivity from folks who otherwise might struggle to bring their gifts to the world. And to me, that's one of the things that is most meaningful about it in a sort of day-to-day way, is just to be in awe of the people in the community who have so much to give and kind of how bad society is at allowing people to use their gifts. Um, it's really made me think as I can kind of move toward going back to work part time. It's doing volunteer work has helped me understand what, again, I don't like the word accommodations, but what accommodations I might need to ask for in my own work. And to be able to do that in an environment where people are by default understanding and caring and encouraging of me taking time off, me not pushing through, of pacing, where all you need to do is to say, hey, I'm feeling crashy, and people will say, "Oh, you need to turn this off right now." It's it's a vision of what I wish our world looked more like and what community care really means. And so that's, I mean, for me, like as a patient, getting on almost 2 years at this point, having experiences not just with long COVID moonshot, but with other groups I've been part of, like Patient Led Research Collaborative and informal groups, friend groups, support groups, those sorts of things. Seeing these patterns has really reshaped how I consider my own needs and how I kind of run my own life. And I would much rather not be sick, of course, and not have had to discover these things in this way, but I'm very grateful that I have discovered these things because they're helpful for me now.
All of what you just mentioned brings to mind several words for me. You're mentioning how accommodations doesn't seem like the right phrase. As you were describing this, I was thinking of words like culture, communication, expectations, and even logistics. The processes that we were used to, that we considered normal, were disrupted by COVID, by lockdowns, and by the aftermath. When we reorganized or reemerged, if you are someone who reflects, you're like, well, how do I want to do things now? And I think what you're describing is building a community and an organization and a structure that works for its members. And I'm also hearing you say that by working with communities that have similarities to you, in this instance, a chronic illness, you're able to identify what you need and what works best for you. So what I'm hearing you say is organizations like this that are centered around patients with fatiguing diseases doesn't have to look like another organization to get its outcome and to meet its mission. Does that sound right to you?
It does. I think it has broadened my mind about what organizations can look like, how people can work together. But ultimately, I think it comes down to some really basic human qualities like compassion, like you said, communication, and being really kind of open to other people's experiences. I mean, even within our own group, people have such a variety of experiences. We have to work really hard to navigate the differences that we have. And that's also part of just being human. And I think that, I would love to see more organizations that think about how can we be more flexible? How can we be more inclusive? Whether it has to do with socioeconomic background, whether it has to do with health status or disability. And what we've seen in the broader world, I think, is almost like a backlash to that, which is really disheartening to me. Think about, again, I don't like the word accommodation, but think about something like in-person work. We saw earlier in the pandemic that the employment of disabled people actually went up because they were able to work from home. least that's one of the theories about it. And by pushing people back into offices, all of a sudden we're excluding not only people who have maybe a high risk of COVID infection, but all these other people that benefit from just a more flexible environment. I think like one of my favorite examples of how accommodations for a disability is useful for everybody are curb cutouts. So, at the end of the block, the little ramps at the end of the curbs, we only really started getting those as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I believe. But I mean, how many people with baby strollers, with suitcases, with heavy loads, like we all use those. They have made the world a better place. And so I think a lot about what are the curb cutouts that we're learning from long COVID. I think about, what are the organizational curb cutouts that I'm learning about at Long COVID Moonshot that I can bring to, hopefully my future non-long COVID related clients. And, I think there's just so much wisdom that comes from these experiences. And in some ways, like, again, I would rather be healthy and not think about these things, I suppose. But now that I've seen these things, I can't unsee them. And I just
Mhm.
really want to share them. And I hope organizations like Long COVID Moonshot show how much people can do even when they have limitations. I mean, it's been really incredible. And I guess I should say that I wasn't one of the founding members. I joined in late January of this year, so I had already seen some of the impact. I had participated in the phone call campaigns. I had sent holiday cards to my representative wishing them an unhappy holidays because that's what I was experiencing. And I think that I've learned so much from joining and from trying to bring kind of my own expertise from this, but I've had to let go of a lot of my preconceived notions as well, and ultimately, I think that's a really good thing for me.
What is Long COVID Moonshot working on currently?
Yeah, so our big push in the last couple of months has been on appropriations. And this is, again, one of these things that I wish I didn't know as much about as I did. But we all had to do our kind of refresher civics lessons to figure this all out. Because, again, our primary goal here is to ensure that there is sufficient and sustained research funding for long COVID at the US federal government level. And so we've had to learn, okay, so how are things funded at the federal level? And, sure, there's some legislation that comes with money attached, but for most of the budget of the federal government, that's negotiated every year by Congress. That's one of Congress's most important responsibilities. And, if you read about government shutdowns and all the politics around this, that's what that is. That is the politicians in Congress arguing back and forth about how our tax money should be spent. And so while there are opportunities like potentially Bernie Sanders' proposed moonshot legislation that might come with perpetual money attached, there are also opportunities to every year to have budget for the NIH and for other institutions earmarked for uses like long COVID. And so a couple months ago, we worked on a advocacy action where we asked interested folks to call their senators to request $1 billion of funding for long COVID, as well as several other requests as well, including funding for research at the DoD, at AHRQ, because even though it's mostly the NIH, there are also other agencies that work in and around medical research and long COVID research. And the results of that is it gets really technical in Congress. It gets really technical really quickly. And so the way that appropriations work is that there's all these committees and subcommittees, and they, deal with the budget requests. And we don't need to get into all that level of detail. But as a result of the community's advocacy efforts, we were able to get, I think, over a dozen senators to sign on to a budget request letter that asked for this funding in the 2025 budget. So we don't know the results of that yet. Appropriations is really fraught. Again, government shutdowns. We have a divided Congress right now. The Senate does their budget, the House does their budget, then they have to agree on a budget. They have not met their deadlines, I think, the last two, if not the last 5 years in a row. So it's going to take some time. But I think that's the thing to really be watching right now is where is appropriations happening? There was a hearing in the Senate, again, about a month ago. That was the NIH budget hearing in the subcommittee in the Senate that manages the NIH's budget. And while this wasn't a long COVID or a long COVID moonshot effort specifically, there were advocates there, many of whom we've worked with, like Megan Stone, again, the person that inspired long COVID studies, she organized a bunch of folks to be at that very ultimately bureaucratic, deep in governance kind of event. And the director of the NIH talked about long COVID and said they need to be doing more. And so what I really like seeing both from long COVID moonshots and all of our allies that care about these same things is we are learning how to apply pressure at the right pressure points so that the folks who have real power and authority are noticing. And so, again, I think watch how the appropriations process plays out. We're kind of waiting to see where we need to engage next. And then you've probably heard about Bernie Sanders' moonshot legislative proposal. To be clear, this is something that came from the Bernie Sanders team. We use the same word moonshot, but it's not like we were working with them on this, but they heard us. They heard the ask. And the team there asked, I believe it was in early April, for feedback from the community. And as far as I know, they're hard at work trying to understand that feedback. And we can expect at some point in the future that probably they will come out with a new proposal or an actual bill that they will introduce. And that's going to be another really important time for the community to say how important that is to them. And to be honest with the team, if there are parts of it that don't meet the challenge that we need it to. And so we're kind of a little bit in preparation mode for some of these things to come out, because ultimately we can advocate, but it's the Congress people that actually are doing the work, and we need to figure out how to, again, collaborate and apply appropriate pressure.
I love that. It is really interesting when you get into the weeds. Some people don't think it's fun to learn about what happens in those weeds. And yet it's those weeds that influence legislation and ultimately funding. If listeners want to hear more about the Help Committee meeting, about AHRQ, which we mentioned here, you can listen to two of my episodes from earlier. One is on a summary of the Help Committee session that we were talking about, that was headed by Bernie Sanders and discussed long COVID funding, and another about long COVID research funding. So I'll link those two below. How can people get involved or learn more about long COVID moonshot?
So probably the best way is to go to our website, longcovidmoonshot.com. We have an email list where we announce different actions that we do. So when we launch a new campaign, we will email about that. We are also on Twitter. A lot of us, we sort of met on Twitter. And so many of us are still very active there. And we are at LC Moonshot. And we're also on Instagram at Long COVID Moonshot. And so when we have something new coming out, we try to make sure that we post it on all of those areas. And I think the best way to get involved is to participate in the campaigns that we put together, but also don't wait for us to do this. Find like-minded advocates. Call your Congress people. I call my Congress people every week because I think they need to hear from me every week. There are a lot of things you can do that don't take a ton of time or a ton of spoons to do. And I really encourage people to get active. There's not really a wrong way to do it, but by we each of us individually may not have a ton of energy, but collectively we are so friggin' powerful. And when we unleash that power, people do notice. I mean, people really, really notice. And I also think it's really important to build bridges with other chronic illness communities, people who have been ill with ME/CFS, with POTS, with MCAS, with Lyme disease, all sorts of conditions that are so similar to long COVID. And if we had only prioritized, maybe we wouldn't be in as big of a mess as we are in. And so that's another way I think folks can get involved, is to really learn about and engage with folks who have other conditions as well.
I echo that. I think it's absolutely important to collaborate with others and find areas that overlap, because it's going to put pressure, like you said, in the right areas and benefit all of us. How do we find long COVID studies?
So Long COVID Studies is at longcovidstudies.net. And you can also sign up for the mailing list that is at the bottom of the screen there. I also have an Instagram at Long COVID Studies, though I have not posted much there yet. I should be clear, that project is a passion project. I have no funding, and right now I don't even have a job. So I would love to eventually find funding and devote more resources and energy to it. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue working on it when I can. There's so much feedback I've gotten from the community, both from patients and researchers, that I would love to implement to make it even more useful for folks. If you have feedback, if you see bugs, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is on the website, and I'm on Twitter at AHHRRR. It is a strange username that I got a decade ago and just keep using for some reason.
And people can donate to both long COVID Moonshot Initiative, but also to long COVID studies when you get onto the website, right? As you search, there's a button, I think, on the website where you can donate if you've benefited from it. So we're going to link all of those in the show notes. If you didn't catch it here by your ears, you can try reading it. As we wind down here, Ezra, I loved this conversation, especially of us talking about organizations that are centered around the needs of a specific group of people, and how we can get really interesting, fascinating, and even really fun work done in a way that doesn't burn us out or doesn't make us crash. You, I understand, are involved in another get together or organization that is also centered around long COVID patients, but has nothing to do with legislation, has nothing to do with big funding, or even much to do about scientific studies. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. What it has to do with is birds. A little bit out of left field, but it's called the Spoonbill Club. Spoons sort of referring to energy spoons. And it was founded by Ed Yong, the science journalist previously of The Atlantic. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Ed. His writing throughout the pandemic was really impactful for me, talking about the human costs. And it's not just me, he won a Pulitzer for it, but he was really one of the first journalists to really try to understand long COVID and to understand its historical context, the science, and the impact on individual people. And Ed is just a wonderful person. He was really moved by that reporting. I think it really changed him. And last year, he moved here to Oakland, California, and got really into bird watching. And he, as he describes it, he found it to be really therapeutic. It was a way to connect with nature that isn't, an adventure sport. It's really about noticing and being curious. And as he puts it, he thought to himself, wait, I wonder if people with long COVID might be able to enjoy this as well. And so earlier this year, he reached out to some of his contacts who have long COVID and other fatiguing illnesses and sort of proposed, what if we go birding together? And the Spoonbill Club was born. We meet about every month now in the Bay Area, in the East Bay, 1 week or 1 month, and in San Francisco the next month. And what's been amazing about it is a few things. So, first of all, like you said, it is centered around people with different needs. And so, like, again, the idea of an accommodation isn't quite right. It is, how do we build an experience that's going to be meaningful and positive for folks who have different abilities? And so that includes, being somewhere with a paved path, because we have participants who have wheelchairs, who have mobility needs. We have folks, we have a couple caregivers who come who will carry around chairs. So for folks with dysautonomia, there is the ability to sit down. Birding is really slow. It's about gazing. It's about seeing what's changing in your environment. And we have a couple of, including Ed, we also have a couple of other leads who are just really incredible at teaching and helping us participants learn about these beings that are all, it's like this whole new layer of the environment that I just wasn't involved with before. Now I have a pair of binoculars and I really look forward to these, but there's this other benefit as well, which I think really relates to what we're talking about, which is that we've also started to build a little community, a local community, where something like long COVID can be so isolating to folks. Being able to be around people who just get it is powerful. And it's also powerful to, again, build bridges, not just with people with long COVID, but people who have had ME/CFS for decades, or who have POTS, or who have other issues, because there is so much that we share. And, it's hard to say, do I look forward to these gatherings because of the nature or because of the people? It's really like 50-50. Both of those things are so important. And so if you happen to be in the Bay Area, Ed has information in his newsletter about how to sign up. It is open to people with energy limiting conditions or caregivers. I encourage you to join us. And if you are elsewhere in the world, think about starting something like this up as well. And I know, I don't want to speak for him, but I'm sure Ed would be happy to share some of his lessons learned. He's written about it in his personal newsletter, which I'm sure we can link to. But it really shows to me just a little bit of effort and a little bit of understanding can make all the difference. And so when we think about our broader communities, our families, our friends who maybe are looking for ways to support us but don't really know, just one other idea of a thing that could be done.
I love that. I hope that I get to join you guys sometime soon.
Oh, I really hope you can.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to link to a lot of what we talked about in the show notes. But in summary, if you want to learn more about Long COVID Moonshot, you can find them at longcovidmoonshot.com. If you want to search for studies that Ezra has organized with you as a long COVID patient in mind, you can go to longcovidstudies.net. I'll link contact information to the Spoonbill Club, which is a birding community for patients with long COVID and other fatiguing diseases. Ezra, is there another way that listeners can learn more about you or follow your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at AHHRRR, or I'd say probably the next best way is to sign up for the email list at longcovidstudies.net.
Thank you so much, Ezra, for joining us. We've learned so much. I've loved talking about accessibility, organization, and communication centered around patients with fatiguing diseases.
Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Now let's go rest. Thanks again to Ezra Spier and to the folks at Long COVID Moonshot. And thank you for listening to another episode of Long COVID MD with me, Dr. Zeest Khan. Check out my new website, Long COVID MD, and join the mailing list so you can be updated on new resources available there as they come. Follow this podcast and leave a nice review if you can. Follow me on X at Dr_Zeest and send me an email at longcovidmd@gmail.com. Say hi, tell me how you like the podcast, and let me know what you think I should cover next or who I should interview. Take good care of yourself, and until next time, bye for now.